This oral history of museum computing is provided by Holly Witchey and was recorded on the 22nd of March, 2021 by Paul Marty and Kathy Jones.
I'm gonna start actually in the early 80s because I went to Kalamazoo College where my majors were art history and political science. And I don't know where it is anymore, but we had career service. We had this K plan, which you did all sorts of special things. And I went to career service and I worked at the Fine Arts Museum of the South in Mobile, Alabama. And I wrote my parents a letter back home and said, I don't know what I want to do. All I know is I don't want it to involve computers. And my mother sent that to me when I was in San Diego. So I went ahead and the agreement with my parents was I could go ahead and study art history as long as I could get some institution to pay for me. And if I couldn't do that, then they would pay for me to go to law school. Those were my two options. So I went to Case Western Reserve University. I did my MA there and my PhD. My PhD is in 15th century Italian fresco painting. You can imagine how pleased my parents were. And in 1990, when I graduated with my PhD, I was engaged to my husband of 30 years. And I had an offer on the table from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago to teach art history. And my husband's father asked if we would fly out to San Diego, where he had purchased a company, to see if Kurt wanted to work there. We flew out to San Diego that spring. We looked at San Diego. We decided we did not want to move there. Came back, and my husband called me a few weeks later and said, we're moving to San Diego. So there was sort of a unilateral, but turned out to be great. I had, luckily there were people at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and the program I was in, my PhD program was the joint program with Case Western Reserve University and the Cleveland Museum of Art. So I had good friends at the Cleveland Museum of Art who made calls for me. And within about 2 months, I was employed at the San Diego Museum of Art, first in the education department in charge of education for college students and adults. And then about less than half a year later, Stephen Brezzo, the director there, reorganized the curatorial department. The curator left, and it became a curatorial department of 3, later 2, with Malcolm Warner as the chief curator of the curator of European art, and I was the associate curator of European art. Steve Brezzo was a fantastically, he's still alive. He's a sort of a, what do I want to say? He's like the ghost of Christmas Present. He's this fantastically larger than life individual who went to school with Jim Henson, and we were always told that the rumor was that Steve Brezzo was the original Big Bird, was the original inspiration for Big Bird. You know, that was just what we said in the hallways. But Stephen was very interested in technologies, and at some point we had a trustee named Morris Kaplan, and Morris went to London and he saw the micro gallery, which was the sort of first interactive installation on a large scale with a collection at the National Gallery of Art, and it had been created by a firm called Cognitive Applications, the principal of whom was Alex Morrison. And Mr. Kaplan, the trustee, called Stephen Brezzo in the middle of the night and said, I want to do something like that at San Diego, and I'll pay for it, but you have to use this firm. And so we came back and we raised money, and I was called in, and Steve put me in charge of this because I had both educational experience and curatorial experience. And so I was part of that group of people. I would call us, Vicky Porter and I used to call us the dinosaurs. We weren't technologists. We were art historians, but for whatever reason, we were able to sort of talk across different constituencies and audiences and get people to come together around projects. And so I'm still not a technologist, but I like to do a lot of things, and I like to be engaged in interesting projects. So not long after that, Alex Morrison and Rory Matthews, his chief designer, came across, and we sat in San Diego and we developed a project. They came over, I believe, in 91, and we spent the next couple of years raising money, and I had a baby, and the project didn't launch till 94, but because you called today, I was able to go back into my files and find things like, oops, this was the original press packet for the image gallery. 300 artworks in one frame. So I was traveling down memory road. Photos, San Diego, 97 said about it. Sorry for the break. Perhaps the most exciting feature of the museum, however, is Image, the interactive multimedia art gallery explorer, which allows visitors to locate the highlights of the museum's holdings on screen and custom design a tour, right? This was before the internet. We were doing something that I still believe in, and I even have, these are Rory's original designs for the interface. I mean, it's just a copy of it, but we worked really hard, and I worked with cognitive applications for more than 20 years on projects because we had a really good working relationship with one another. Alex Morrison is one of the brightest people I've ever met. Rory Matthews, a brilliant designer. He went on to design the interactives for the Royal Collection when he went off as RoryMatthews.com. Ben Rubenstein, who is with Alex Morrison, the other principal of cognitive applications, is, to my mind, the most brilliant programmer ever. I just love everything that Ben has ever done. And I think the magic was everybody there really cared about art and art museums, and they like to look at things, and they know why people like to look at things. So we built the image gallery, and we had so much fun. And I'm sure you've heard stories like this before, right? We couldn't have image gallery in the galleries with the works of art. You can't have the technology and the art competing. So they gave us a little room just to the left of the staircase in the San Diego Museum of Art. And Mitch Gall, the designer, built this fantastically Jetsony installation for it that had like two, they were shaped like flying saucers, two circular areas with flying saucers. And it wasn't until the night when we were installing that we realized that the guys were going to have to bench press these massive computers up into the installation because they really hadn't given any way. So the sort of fourth member of that team was Nick Honeysett, who later went on to the Getty. So Nick was the junior programmer that they left in place to help me do things and to get everything finished. So Nick was down bench pressing these computers into the installation. The other thing Image Gallery had at the time that was remarkable was we bought, ready for it, an $11,000 dye sublimation printer. It was the most expensive piece of equipment we had in there, and it would take 5 minutes, but it would chug out, a full color print of the works in the collection. And until that time, if you'd wanted a print, you normally got black and whites, and you had to apply to the registrar's office. I'm amazed that I have so many things that I was able to access today. It even had an Easter egg. The program did. Let me see if I can find it. Whee! So here's an example of one of the dye sublimation prints, just an 8x10, and it printed out a label and stuck the label on the back, and there were envelopes, and people went away with their wonderful prints from the collection. And I can remember in the first couple of weeks being very frustrated. We had a desk in there with a full-time attendant to print off and to answer questions because people really didn't know how to use these, and they were touch screens. So there was a lot of cleaning that needed to be done. And I can remember in the first couple of weeks, people, more than one person came in and wanted to see the Mona Lisa. And I had to explain that the Mona Lisa wasn't there. Well, but that's really what they wanted to see. And you know, luckily a few years later, the internet came around and people are able to see whatever they wanted to see. So the image gallery was really my start. And then once we had done that, we got to a place where we were making interactives quite frequently. And my rule of thumb at the San Diego Museum of Art, which was in agreement with the director there, was uh, we didn't have, we tried to make things with the permanent collection in mind. And only very occasionally would we do things for special exhibitions, because the goal is if we were going to spend the time and the money to get something done, we wanted it to be something that could be reused. And that was something that I took, that when Len Steinbeck hired me to come to the Cleveland Museum of Art, that's something that I took with me. We tried very hard, even when we were doing interactives for special exhibitions, to make sure that they focused on pieces that were in the collection. So did a lot of interactives at San Diego. I was at San Diego from 90 until 2000, and then I took the job at the Cleveland Museum of Art. In San Diego, we did a beautiful one with dragon robes that was actually a Chinese cabinet that you could pull the drawers out, virtually pull the drawers out and look at pieces, and pieces would pop out that Rory designed. It was just a really wonderful time, I feel, because we were thinking about projects in depth. We were able to go through various levels. It wasn't, it was a time when people wanted more information, where there weren't the restrictions. You know, you can do it in 30 words, or you can do it in 50 words, you can do it in 80 words. We really had the time, I think, to think through projects and sort of go as wonderfully deep as we wanted to in discovering kingfisher feathers in Chinese jewelry. Then the World Wide Web came about. I was at San Diego, like I said, until 2000. Len Steinbeck, who I had met at conferences, because Steve Brezzo wanted us to be involved in technology. And Steve had been invited, based on the image gallery and based on the work we were doing, he had been invited to speak at the governor's conference of the arts and technologies in California. I don't even remember what year that was, but Stephen couldn't go. So I ended up on a panel with Ken Hama. And sort of that was my real introduction to the world of technology conferences. And so from that time on, San Diego is really good about Museum Computer Network, about Governor's Conference for the Arts, about AAM, presenting at AAM, presenting at ICHM, presenting at Museums and the Web. And then there was the conference that Jim had in England. What was that called? Do you remember? I can't think of the name of it.
I believe it was EVA.
EVA. Yeah, did a lot of sessions at EVA, which reminds me of a story. Nick Honeysett was always a practical joker. And when I was going over to give my first presentation at EVA about the image gallery, CogApp was going to have one of their younger employees meet me up there to set up the technology. And Nick Honeysett told them I was a tall, slender blonde. Told this young, much fun ensued, I can tell you, as he searched for me and didn't find me. Oh well. Cleveland was quite a different case, and Cleveland, the Cleveland Museum of Art is one of the big powerhouse museums in the United States. But they hadn't done much in technology, but they had hired Len Steinbeck to come in and be CIO. And Len hired me to come in and be first the manager and then director of new media. Cleveland Museum of Art, which under Jane Alexander is the technology museum. You know, I sort of came in a period when technology was greeted warily and reluctantly. The very first interactive we did, I believe the first one we did was for an exhibition of Victor Schreckengast's works. Victor was 100 at the time. He was an industrial designer, and scholars of American history believe that everybody in America has used or seen or been exposed to something that Victor Schreckengost designed. For example, one of his great inventions was pedal car or toy cars for children. Ride-in toy cars for children were very, very expensive. And what Victor Schreckengost figured out is if he could just bend the axle so that the axle could become the pedals, you could make them much simpler. So inexpensive pedal collars for children. He was a ceramic artist. He was a printmaker. He designed, in the 1930s, he belonged to a local pottery company called Cowan Pottery. And when you went in that day as one of the artists, you would pick a slip out of a punch bowl, out of a fish bowl, and that would tell you what project you were going to work on. And Victor got the job to create a punch bowl for a woman in New York City, and it turned out to be Eleanor Roosevelt. And he created something that's called the Jazz Bowl. Anyway, so Victor is this local character, and Henry Adams, the American art historian, had written a exhibition catalog for this exhibition that read exactly like scripts for interactive animations. So one of Henry's sentences that I'll never forget was, the shift from pottery to pedal cars was not as hard as you might think. And so we took these, and again, I was working with CogApp, we took these bits and created these animations and built this absolutely beautiful installation. And it was Len who said, we're not going to have it on a little screen, not even a 28 screen. What we're going to do is we're going to have a big screen up above, and then we're going to have a little screen, and the grown-ups who don't want to approach technology will watch the kids who will be doing anything, and they can see what's going on the screen above. It was great. It was brilliant. The curator would not let us have it in the exhibition. We had to put it in the gift shop at the end of the exhibition. And Catherine Lee Reed, the director, came through, and at the end of her walkthrough of the exhibition, she saw the interactive, and she said, put it out in the entrance to the exhibition. So that was sort of and we continued to fight those battles, but I think even fighting those battles, another thing we learned to do was that many of us, the people I'm sure you're talking to, learned to do was work with the curators who were interested. You know, if you could get an interested curator to do some sort of great project, then others would follow suit. So we did a lovely Picasso's exhibition of Picasso's La Vie, where you could look at the painting and then go into the X-rays and the infrareds. And some of the things that I'm talking about are old hat now, but they were new then, and they were remarkable, and people would stand at the screen and use the right, there was a magnifying glass, so they could touch and go deeper into the magnifying glass, deeper into the work of art. I sometimes feel that I'm not very articulate. Anyway, I do think it was a wonderful, it was 1990 to 2010 was a wonderful time to be in this field. I want to give full credit to Jane Alexander, because had I stayed at the Cleveland Museum of Art, I'm certain I wouldn't have come up with Gallery 1. I would have done something different. But at the time I was at Cleveland, we were getting to do exciting things. Like we built a glorious interface to the website, which linked the proprietary collections management system to a function on the website, and gave deep information. You know, and I think part of it for me was as an art historian, I knew what I wanted to see and was able to make it happen. And none of this happened in a vacuum. I keep using the word I, but in every place I worked, there were these fantastic teams of people. And I can remember, I think it was the Victor Schreckengost. It must have been the first interactive. There was something wrong, and we could not get the first interactive to work. And Bob Ladd, one of the hardware people at the museum, just took me aside and said, sit back, relax. We are not going to fail as a team. And we didn't fit yet. It was a team. So Doug Highwiller and Tom Hood and Bob Ladd and Bob Noon and Michael Hilliard, we were all in there doing things together. And sort of another thing about Cleveland, because Cleveland had these high-powered shows, we did an interactive for a Burgundy show, a Court of Burgundy show, and worked with students at the Cleveland Institute of Art and with a designer at the Cleveland Institute of Art, and animated a table fountain, a Burgundian table fountain, and did this beautiful, and and it was days of rendering, and the interactive is delivered to us ready to go the day before the exhibition is going to open. And we've got the equipment and we're all ready, but technology is the last thing that goes in. So we can't go into the exhibition until the last courier is done. So way after midnight, I'm sitting at the museum with Michael Hilliard to help install, and I think Doug Highwiller might have been there too. And we're waiting because a courier from the Louvre was coming in with 2 little gold figures. And he came in from his courier trip with his briefcase handcuffed to his list. And we just sat there and twiddled our fingers until he was out and the case was down. And we did, we always managed to get it installed in time. But I can remember more hours, more after hours time than I think people do today. And with those early interactives, somebody had to go into the San Diego Museum of Art every morning and turn it on. And on the weekends, that was me or the person who was sitting there. For the Cleveland Museum of Art, somebody had to go in and make sure those things were working and the screen was clean, and that was our responsibility. So there was a lot of boots on the ground work that was really, really fun. Oh my gosh. I just said really, really fun, didn't I? Oh, it was so lovely. I just got to work with lots of lovely people. And it was a great time to be a pioneer in technology. There were fantastic people all over the world when we would go to these conferences, when we go to ICHIM and EVA, and David Bierman and Jennifer Trant, put together these panels, and Susan Hazan from Israel. There are all sorts of people who we're all still friends, and we get together on video chats when we can. But to have memories of technology and Paris. I can remember sitting at a Paris ICHIM where they were making us wait for one of the events was the preview of a Salvador Dali CD-ROM. And they had banks. We were in the Louvre, and there were banks of champagne and glasses, but we couldn't have any of that until we'd actually gone in the auditorium and heard the presentation. And I remember the man in the presentation started out saying, if Salvador Dali was alive today, the first thing he would do is make a CD-ROM. and I think that's kind of the measure of how important we thought our work was, or what we thought we were doing. We went into this with all the hubris that this is going to change the world. And it did in a few ways. Maybe not as much as we hoped. But it was so great to see. It's been so fantastic to see, I would say, the next generation and the next 2 generations of fantastic people who are working in museums and making things happen. I would say it's my generation, but Scott, I can't imagine what we would do without Scott, who's now at Corning, taking the world, or without his wife, Chris Vetterland, who's one of the fantastic educators of our times. Vicki Porter, who did the micro gallery at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. Slavko Milosevic, and all the work he was doing. I can remember him displaying his first, it was the face where the children were taught to eat vegetables or fruits by picking the right. It was just remarkable because I wasn't one of the smart people, but I got to hang around with a lot of truly smart people. There was this woman named Catherine Jones and this guy named Paul Marty, and I would go see them and hear their sessions at conferences. Jim Devine at the University of Glasgow. It was just remarkable. Do you have a question for me? Because I think I'm running out of steam here.
Sure, I can jump in with a couple of questions. I'm fascinated with this sort of this changing philosophy about bringing technology into the galleries, right? Because you lived through this period where people were extremely reluctant to have that happen, to where now it's an integral component. And you said something about how the trick was working with the curators who really wanted to do this. And what do you think led to the change in philosophy on the part of more curators to be more accepting of technology?
Well, I think they're more accepting of technologies, but I really haven't seen that they're more accepting to having it in their galleries per se. I think we still see a lot of cases where this is perhaps not the most appropriate use of the word ghetto, where technology is put somewhere by itself, and there may be artworks in with it, but I still think it's fairly rare for it to be integrated into the gallery space. And that's because, I'm curator myself. Curators are interested in what they're interested in, and they don't want to go into their prize gallery and see everyone next to a screen. But what the pandemic will do, I don't know, until we figure out better ways. And some people are already figuring out better ways so you don't have to clean screens. I do sometimes worry about the smallness of our phones and the sort of trivializing of information that you can find. One of the things that I did like was being able to see images blown up, being able to see details blown up. And I suppose we're getting a little bit of that with on steroids with all these immersive exhibitions that are going on all around the country now. Intellectually, it's quite interesting to me that you would walk into a Van Gogh painting and turn around. And I can't say I think a lot about this, but when I do think about it, I'm like, so what is it that you're getting from that? What is it that we're asking people to get from that? So I think the way technology has ramped up is we can do a lot of stuff so much more easily than we could. There isn't the sort of paper thought process. I hate to sound like a troglodyte, but there isn't the because you can make templates, because you can make what are they called in technology? Wireframes so easily now. There isn't the sitting around. Who's sitting around at the table with a pencil or a napkin sketching out and then changing that to a template and adjusting that? So I think we have shorter runways that get us great technology. And I guess I'm glad I was in one of those bigger planes that had a longer runway.
It's interesting. You mentioned Scott Sayer earlier. We talked to him a couple of weeks ago, and he actually said something very similar about missing the richness of the interactive exhibits from the 80s and the 90s. I like the way you put it a minute ago. There's a bit of trivializing of the information in the online world. I guess we're all kind of feeling a little old now, but I talk with my undergrads, right? And there's a reluctance to dig deep into anything, right? Everybody wants to skim along the surface, and they learn lots of really interesting stuff. But I wonder about the museum's role to encourage people to stop and have a deep and rich experience, and what's happened with that and technology.
Well, and it's interesting that, in the sort of great pendulum swings that go on in museums, perhaps this is slow looking. education departments are increasingly falling back on slow looking and engagement with the object. And the other thing, because I'm a huge supporter of the current generation and them doing with technology what they want to do for their audiences. And so there's so much good work being done in the realm of social justice and things which I would not have been very good at. I was just really interested in how Rubens painted women. That's not quite true, but I can remember having a sort of an aha moment. We had an exhibition of Winslow. I think it was Winslow Homer's genre paintings, and being able to spend the time to go deeply and look at local color literature and how the painters who were painting these paintings and the authors who were writing the books were all in the same society together and feeding off one another. And that just felt like a really rich opportunity living in San Diego, where you spent half your life on a highway, just to spend some quiet time with Winslow Homer was a pleasure.
I have a question, Holly. I'm wondering, I'm going to take you back to the Cleveland Museum. What you and Len did, I would imagine, provided some infrastructure for what Jane Alexander could do, or am I wrong?
Oh, absolutely. Infrastructure, because the infrastructure was changing so much, but I think what it did is people expected things to happen at Cleveland, and they did. And she has a very different skill set, and was able to build a team, and then partnered with Eric at Piction, to do a digital asset management system. Right, we were working without digital asset management systems until sort of the closer to 2008, 2009. So the things you can do once you get a digital asset system too is fantastic. If I have one regret, it's that all of the things that are really gestural that are happening now, and the games and things that you can play, that seems to me like that would have been fun.
Yeah, I keep trying to talk Kathy into buying an Oculus Quest, because I tell you, the immersive VR experience in the museum world is amazing. And Scott Sayer said they've got one coming out.
Paul. Just a matter of days.
Just a matter of days. Yes. Well, Scott said they're releasing one for Corning that's supposed to be just absolutely spectacular in terms of an immersive experience there. And Holly, you also talked about this upcoming generation. And I say, I totally agree. What I'm seeing with my undergrads just over the last 5 to 10 years, such an awareness of social justice issues, and awareness of how to use the internet to affect positive change, and an increased awareness of how they're being manipulated online, right? And how to fight against that. So there's really something special about this upcoming generation for sure. And I'll be curious to see how they use museum technology.
Well, and to go back to the virtual reality, so we have a group that developed the HoloLens here at Case Western Reserve University, and they developed it for a really interesting application for anatomy students to look at the body. So you could put your lenses on and all look at a model and talk about things. And they had HoloLens had done a project with the art school everybody goes to, the art history program everybody goes to in London. I can't think of anything right now. Everybody goes over and gets their master's degree at the Courtauld. They had done a program with the Courtauld, and basically had some works in HoloLens, so you could put your lenses on, and it would look like you had a painting in your living room, or a mummy. You could put a mummy on your coffee table. And I had a conversation with them about digging deeper. And then the chair of my department, Elizabeth Bowman, who's a specialist in the Red Monastery in Egypt, which is closed, but she did 3D renderings. She worked and did 3D renderings of 3D scans of the entire interior and exterior of Red Monastery. And now her students this semester are using it to get close. Her art history students are using it to get close to places they couldn't see. You know, you can't get on a ladder, but with a HoloLens, you can go way up, and they can go in places that women aren't allowed. So I think that's an accessibility issue too. Although that does bring up another question. One of the things I've been doing, not technology work, but just sort of I've gotten engaged with the Native American community and indigenous communities through ATALM, the Association of Tribal Archive Libraries and Museums. And I heard a really interesting presentation a couple of years ago about Native American protocols for digital materials and physical materials, so that there are objects that are sacred, and if the object is sacred, the photograph of the object inherits those same tendencies, and the description of the object inherits those tendencies. So there's a lot of conversation about how do we let things die naturally, you know, and we're all three of us are engaged in preservation, but what does it mean to actively not preserve something for the right reasons, which I think is also very interesting.
That's another really important philosophical shift as well, because in the early days of technology working with art history, people rarely asked the community or the art historians or the artist about their, that was more of a content that the technology people were simply using to test their technologies. And we've come a long way since then. And I love this perspective of the indigenous community and getting their voice into these projects, which was so often lost in the early days.
Well, and I had a conversation once with about a spirit drum or a ghost drum that was going to be given back, and they build places where the ghost drum can be placed and where it can decay. And so the question was, well, before it goes, can we do a video or an animation of it being played? And like, no, you can't do that. I understand. And it's not for me to say no, but again, intellectuals and intellectual exercise, if you're not supposed to see it, you're not supposed to take a photograph of it, you're not supposed to animate it. And I think that's hard for a lot of people.
Yeah, we had a big discussion about that, how technology can support decolonizing the museum,
Mm-hmm.
and in some cases whether it should. So that's so on target, Holly, about that.
Yeah, I had an interesting discussion with my graduate students last week about what's the difference between repatriation and de-accessioning. And I know we're out completely off technology, but I don't know if you saw the Syracuse had the 2-day de-accessioning thing, and people have started using this term progressive de-accessioning. I think is such an interesting concept that, again, when I have some free time, I want to break down that if you put the word progressive in it, does it make it good? Does it make it right? Does it change the rules? I don't know.
Yeah, I only got to a few of those sessions, but they were all very interesting. I think my takeaway was the comment that blockchain is a registrarial tool. I told Paul that on Friday. I thought that was amazing.
Yeah, and who knew? What are they called? NTFs?
Oh yeah.
Who knew?
Fungible tokens. Yep.
Very, very glad not to have to worry about that on top of everything.
I know.
But again, I get back to what worries me, which is that if people only understand the technology, then these things can be misused. And Holly, you were talking earlier about, understanding the technology, but also understanding the world of art history and understanding the curatorial viewpoint and being able to build bridges among all of these communities. Where are our bridge builders today, right? Because we don't want to get trapped in separate silos again.
Right. Yeah, and well, right. If you're a big enough museum, you're already siloed, but you have to hope that people will talk to one another. It's all right. Museum success is all about communication.
Well, we had a long chat with Seb Chan about that a few weeks ago, which was also just a brilliant conversation that I'm glad we have recorded, because he was talking about there's an institutional knowledge that museums developed over the past few decades that has been lost in just the past few years, and a lot of people are worried about that.
At one point, Angela Spinazzi and I were talking about trying to raise money to get a retreat for women to talk about the women who had been technologists over the past 20 or 30 years. Because if you were at a small museum and you didn't do your own cataloging and making sure things did survive, they just didn't. I don't think there's anything left of my work at San Diego, except what I have here and in COGAP's archives and in the other developers that we used. And but we weren't preserving, we weren't thinking about that. And I think
you had it in your hand today.
yeah,
On your desktop now.
Yeah, I have.
You have proof.
Yeah, I have two pictures. I have two transparencies of it. And I have the free flyer. This was before ICHM. This was the hands-on hypermedia and interactivity in museums, which is ICHM 95 and MCN 95. And this is the flyer we gave out.
That's great.
So people could come and see the image gallery for themselves.
In San Diego.
In San Diego. And I would like to say, I don't think you can have a conversation with Seb Chan that isn't intellectually rich. He's amazing. There's some amazing people out there.
Amazing. And what we're talking about here also connects with another theme we've heard a lot, that the projects themselves die, right? They don't have a long time frame, but the process that we go through, the knowledge that the friends we make along the way, right? That's the important thing that we don't want to lose. And I don't know how do we hang on to that institutional knowledge, especially as people retire or leave the field.
Well, and how do you capture? Well, that's part of what you're doing, is capturing that institutional knowledge. And you have to walk that fine line between, oh my gosh, we tried that 10 years ago and that won't work. You can't say that to a young person coming into the field. Just sort of have to nod sagely and think maybe it'll be different this time, and and try to help them over the hard bits.
Yeah, but we want to tell them that, no, that won't work. We tried that before. Paul, go ahead. I know you want to talk about that.
Well, I mean, I'll tell very, very quickly, but Holly, were you at the virtual MCN 2020 in November?
Mm-mm.
Right, so I was there, and you probably saw that MCN got a very nice grant from the Knight Foundation to do some online community building. So I went to their conference session to find out what they want to build, and they said, well, we have this great idea. We'll build a project registry for MCN projects where everybody can upload information about their projects and post that online. And I think it was me and Bruce Wyman in the virtual audience who were like, in 2008 we did this. But not a single person on the team that was proposing this be done knew that MCN had tried this in the past.
Well,
not a single person.
No, and that's I would say that a great problem that was caused by the professionalism of technology in museums was this desire that when you got into a new museum, to throw away what had been done before and to start over again. And that's a factor more of, what people individually need to do to succeed. And I don't know, I think in my life, I have not been as grateful to the people who came before me as I should have been. And I'd like to make up for that now, and encourage the people in these positions to practice gratitude. And if the person who had the job before you is still living, to call them up and say, hey, I'd like to know what you've done. What if we made it a practice that one of the things you do is you call your predecessor and keep a record for a predecessor. We just instituted that as best practice. before you start to do anything new, find out what came before.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting academic question as well. We talked about this a lot at MCN too, right? Maybe the fact that there isn't a published proceedings means that there's not the mindset where people do a lit review before they give a talk, right?
That has always been the way, isn't it? That's why people wanted to go to ICHM instead of EVA, because you got a publication out of it. So that's kind of, but it doesn't matter. Still, so much wonderful work was done. But you're right. And how do they do a lit review? They can't. And there's no doubt that conference organizers, there are people who are favorites for a while and then fall out of favor. So again, it's interesting to look at all those ICHM books and all the MCN books and AAM and see who the big people were on campus and what their ideas were and how they trickle down. One of the projects I started at San Diego, which we never got off the ground, was something called the clinical chart for works of art. And I was working with Maurizio Saracini in Florence, this idea that you could take a group of paintings and do a complete examination on them, and then put sensors on them and put sensors on the walls and sort of follow them, because even though their lifespans are much longer than our lifespans are, you can still see the changes that happen, and having a hygrothermograph in the corner doesn't necessarily tell you what's happening with that work on the wall. Unfortunately, I think that's one of those projects that it's just too costly for people to wrap their minds around.
Holly, I wanted to just get back to a thought a few minutes ago of calling your predecessor, but also to take it into a theme that Paul and I have heard from a lot of people, which is, even Seb Chan, is to document your work.
Yep.
And so Seb is good about that in his blog. David Behrman was good about that in his publications. And I think that's one way that we can kind of keep knowledge in the field as well. So did that happen at San Diego or Cleveland?
In Cleveland, did it happen? Yes. Did we put away a hard drive with each? When I was there, we put away a hard drive with each of the interactives. There was, there was the documentation for the interactives. Sometime around 2006, 2007, we had to move out of the building because they were renovating, and bunches of records went into deep storage. And so do those still exist? And I haven't had the heart to try. And in San Diego, we were just too small a staff. We were busy trying to get the next thing done. Yeah.
Yeah. One of my students is writing about new media art and had the example of Andy Warhol's Amiga discs and how they were recovered. And that just flashed through my mind again. Even if you found them, could you actually recover the data? So
I wrote, when we first started talking, I wrote this little note to myself that said Wayne Thiebaud and David Hockney. And I need to get these two stories recorded somewhere, because this is about copyright. Because when we started doing the image gallery, we knew we were going to use these 300 works of art. And so anyone who fit the category, we sent up a nice letter and said, this is what we're doing. And there was a little note that if you would agree to it, that said, artist name, and then we had a line that said capacity in case it was a gallery representative who was doing it. And Wayne Thiebaud sent the sheet back to me, and it's his name and his signature and capacity. 3 martinis are equivalent, which I loved. And then we got into this huge runaround with David Hockney. wasn't a huge runaround. We asked if we could use the San Diego David Hockney in the image gallery. And he sent a note back and said, no, we could not use it in the image gallery. So I wrote him a note and I said, and he explained, why that, he was fearful of what would happen and he didn't want copies of it being printed off. And he wrote, or he or somebody wrote this very nice letter. And I wrote back and I said, can we use the letter in the image gallery? And he said, no. But for the time, it was a really nice artist statement on why, no, I don't want you putting this online. So I always feel warmly towards Wayne Thiebaud and David Hockney.